Let's talk about Return of the Knights by Gregory Kontaxis. Hello everyone, welcome back to A Fictional Escapist. My name is Kris, and today's video is a quick review of Return of the Knights by Gregory Kontaxis. Before we jump into the review today, make sure you're checking the description box down below for links to my social media and Discord should you want to come along for the ride. Now, Return of the Knights was this wonderfully classic feeling fantasy which really didn't overpromise but gave us a lot of good stuff in terms of knights, some classic fantasy creatures, and a whole lot of backstory that I really appreciated through this story. We start off with Sophie Delamere, who is the queen to Nightdawn. Nightdawn is now under threat from the most notorious war leader the world has ever seen. And to make matters worse, they're related. Warren and his ghosts have their eye on the kingdom and will stop at nothing until all lands are under his rule. With a seemingly endless supply of warriors and beasts, Warren is ready to make his move and become king to all. Very little can save Sophie and her kingdom from a fate wrapped in servitude. That is until 17-year-old Elliot, a self-proclaimed knight taught by one of the Grand Masters, walks into Sophie's life and offers his protection. Sophie is skeptical, as the Grand Masters have been thought long dead and knighthood outlawed many years ago, but eventually she takes a chance on the young lad and for others to carry messages of war and requests for aid to her allies. Strong-willed Elliot is determined to help his kingdom whatever the cost. He will fight tooth and nail to protect the queen and save her lands from destruction. Suddenly, trapped in a game of politics, Elliot and his chosen few will need to work together to save them all. Now, Return of the Knights was an enjoyable debut that really homes in on some of our favourite classic fantasy tropes. What I will say is this story doesn't stray outside of the box. The story itself feels rather safe, in my opinion, but in saying that, it does accomplish exactly what it sets out to do. There were a few things that I did really like in Return of the Knights that are worth mentioning, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. The first one is the history and the backstory of the world that unfolds through conversations that are had as our crew are traveling across the land. Some of these were really cool, and I appreciated a lot of the thought that went into these backstories. As a world building driven reader, I always appreciate when these things come to the forefront and give me a little bit more context to the world itself. I also liked that we had these classic fantasy creatures that graced the story at times and made this world feel like it had much more to give. The criticisms I hold for this book are mainly around the prose and the storytelling style, but we'll get into that a little bit later. As always, let's start with the positives. There's been a lot of work and thought put into having the characters of this story feel like they are part of something much bigger than themselves. As Elliot and his entourage travel the lands seeking aid from Warren and his armies, we do get to learn a lot of the land's history around a campfire while they're traveling through. Our main protagonist here is very young, and he only really knows what has been handed down to him via his Grand Master. During these snippets of conversation and history, we get to find out that maybe he hasn't been told everything in truth, and maybe there is more to the backstory than really meets the eye. From these conversations and revelations, we can see his thoughts and feelings start to change about the world and around him and how that might affect future decisions he'll have to make. I will say there is one particular scene in this book or one story that is being shared around a campfire, and I was utterly captivated by what was happening on the page. And another character in this particular scene said, "Oh, we don't need to know about this story. We've all heard it 100 times before." And I was reading the book being like, no, I need to know about this story. Thankfully, it did continue on, but it was almost like someone in real life interrupting me reading a story. Like, I just didn't want it to end. And that is something magical that happens in a book when you have those sort of, I guess, out-of-body experiences almost, where what is happening on the page affects you so much in your real life. And that doesn't happen to me very often. So, hats off to the author for doing that. Through these stories and this travel, the world itself opens up to include so much more than the group of humans we were following. I mentioned classic fantasy creatures before, and The world is full to the brim with these ancient creatures such as centaurs. We have talks of elves, of dwarves, you name it. This book has got it. There was even friggin' mermaids mentioned at some point. Learning about these creatures and the different walks of life that they went through and how they incorporate themselves into the history was a really cool way to world build, and it gives the reader something to look forward to expanding in the future installments of this series. Which brings us to what didn't work for me all that well in this particular story. The prose and the structure here felt somewhat uninspired, in my opinion. The prose was quite dry and formal, not to say that it was bad in any way, it just felt like it lacked imagination to some extent. The way that people interacted felt forced sometimes, and it lacked the personality of individual characters. I found that a lot of the time when our characters were talking outside of the pirate like character, they all tended to sound a little bit the same. The formality also led to some over explanations of certain things that happened in the book, and there were sequences that definitely felt more tell than show. Again, not necessarily a bad thing if that's what the author was going for, but I felt like that wasn't the case in this particular book. I'll also mention that the plot itself was very linear and logical, which can be very comforting to some people when you go into it. It's not necessarily a bad thing at all if that's what you're looking for. And as I mentioned before, this book does not at all fail to achieve what it sets out to do from the very beginning. But from the very beginning, you know what you're in for. So we have young man, we're going on this quest, and we do that throughout the book with very little intervention from any outside parties. Now, I do want to reiterate at the end here, this was an enjoyable book. There is certainly enough for me to want to pick up the next installment. I'm interested in the novella that may already be out, I'm not 100% sure, from this author, and I know that I will want to continue as the books continue in the series and the author develops their craft. And I'm looking forward to seeing where Elliot goes now that those rose-tinted glasses have had to come off with his preconceptions of the world that we're in. That was a really short review of The Return of the Knights by Gregory Kontaxis. Have you read this one? Are you thinking of picking it up? Please let me know in the comments down below. If you like the content, give it one of those. If you want to see more of it, click subscribe at your will, and I will catch you in the next video. Ciao.